Hello everyone, in this recording we'll introduce brush events. Brushes are a way of selecting many points within a plot simultaneously. The syntax for using them is going to look very familiar to click events. So even in the UI, we're again modifying an argument to plot output, but here instead of using click inputs, we're going to be asking for brush inputs, so we set the brush argument. Again, the ID here can be whatever you want, just make sure that in the server you refer to the same ID. What is the general logic for using brushes? It's very similar to using clicks. So again, we initialize some reactive value. Typically this will be maybe none of the points are selected at the start. So this might be a vector of all falses at the beginning. You're going to observe for whenever the user has brushed the plot. So we're going to check this input we just defined here. We're going to observe if that is ever used. If it is used, you're going to try to get what are the currently selected points. You're going to update the reactive value using that new selection. And once the reactive value changes, that's going to trigger any downstream nodes to rerun. So if I depend on this selected here, then I can regenerate my plot, somehow emphasizing the selected points. Okay, that's the high-level idea. So let's look at an example. So the idea in this figure, maybe let's just look at the figure first. It's the same data set as before. When I brush over some points, I'm regenerating the plot so that it's highlighting the selected points, and I'm also updating the tables that I'm only showing the ones under the brush. I move my brush, it's going to recompute the reactive value. The updated reactive value is going to trigger the render plot and the table. Let's just see that in the actual code. Okay, so here was the plot brush input. It starts off, so actually I start them all off as true. So in the beginning they're actually all selected. And then anytime there's a brush, I'm going to reset the selection. This is just some helper function that's going to figure out what are the points under the brush. I'm going to use that to reset the value of selected. Again, remember, it's this kind of function syntax to reset the reactive value. And then since this reactive value appears in both of these outputs, both of those outputs are going to be regenerated. So those are the two nodes at the very end of the reactive graph. They both depend on selected. So the main thing that's different here compared to the click events is instead of having the near points helper function, we're using this brushed points function. Near points was giving us this distance vector. Here we're getting a vector of what points are under the brush. This is the key piece. Okay, so that is kind of the analog of click events, but for brushes. Something that brushes excel at is when you have many different kind of faceted views, how can you try to coordinate across all those views using a brush? So this is such a common pattern that it has its own name. It's called dynamic linking. Let's look at an example. So this is going to be the penguins data set. Remember, penguins data has many different dimensions. We're going to try to figure out when we drag over one plot, we're going to figure out the corresponding samples in the other plot, and we're going to highlight those. The reason this is very interesting is even though we're plotting everything just in 2D, we're starting to be able to make comparisons in higher dimensions. We're able to find relationships both within each of the two scatter plots and between variables across the scatter plots. Let's look at just how it works, and then we'll look at the code. So let's say I'm interested in these points in the border here for flipper and body mass. Okay. This is where they are on the build depth. So you're already beginning to see that the ones with the smaller flipper length also tend to have the lower build depth among these Gen 2 penguins. And then you can move the brush around, and it's highlighting the corresponding points in the opposite plot. And there's also a brush here. So when I move my brush on this plot, it's the corresponding points. How do we implement this? Let's look at the code. So these are just helper functions just like before. They're just a scatter plot highlighting kind of function and a helper to get the brushed points. In the UI, we now have two plot outputs. Both of them have a brush. I again have this selected reactive value. At the beginning, every point is selected. Right? That's why when we started off, there were no transparent points. Every time I do a brush for either brush, because they both have the same ID. So anytime I brush on either plot, then it's going to be observed by this observe event. We're going to reset the selection. So it's going to tell us which of the current rows of my data frame are actually being brushed over. That's going to just be some vector of trues and false, where the length is the same as the number of rows in this data frame. From there, I'm passing it into my scatter plot. And the way the scatter plot is working, it kind of introduces a new column every time. It's updating this new column of which points are selected, which points are not selected, and it's encoding whether it's selected or not.